everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to discuss Fidelity, one of our favorite topics. As people are entering the space and kind of getting acclimated, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're joining us from, what maybe something you're interested in pulling out of today's webinar. The session is being recorded, but we would love to see where you're coming from and maybe your role within implementation as we get started. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We will have people joining us throughout the session for this 1 hour quick overview of understanding Fidelity is a superpower. So as we get started, just a few logistical items. Everyone is muted at this time to kind of give us an opportunity to go through our material and our content, but we are going to open it up to a Q&A session at the end if we have a few minutes. Amelia, our great project manager from SISEP, is going to be watching the chat and monitoring if you have any questions, if you have any needs. And we're going to also record any of those, take any questions you pop into the chat and ensure that we follow up with you on them. So that way you get all of your questions answered on the topic of Fidelity. So real quick, just who are we? Well, who is the SISEP Center? So the SISEP Center is an organization, a project that's funded by the Office of Special Education Programming. We receive funding to provide technical assistance to state departments, 2 of which have joined us today, as well as TA centers and districts around the use of implementation science to improve outcomes for students. So that's just a little bit about us. If you'd like to learn more, I'm going to have Amelia drop our website in the chat. So that way you can check out our website, get to know us, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at SIP Center or SISEP Center. So who's here today? Why are we here and who is here? So we have my partner in crime today, Corey Watkins. Corey, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself to our audience.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Corey Watkins, and I work at NERN and SISEP Center with Rebecca Hornick, and I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about Fidelity.
I am Rebecca Hornick, your implementation and communication specialist from NERN and SISEP. Corey and I will be hosting this session, going through a brief overview of our brief. And I'm also pleased to introduce our guest today. John, go ahead and introduce yourself.
John Gipple. I am an implementation specialist from the Minnesota Department of Education. We've been doing implementation work since 2009, I think. So it's been a great run.
And Ashley.
Hi, I'm Ashley Cook. I'm a state transformation specialist with the Kentucky Department of Education. So I work to support the implementation of the state systemic improvement plan. And so we've been doing implementation work since about 2014.
Welcome. We are super excited to have you share your stories around Fidelity measurements and OTIS today. So who's online? Who's out there? Who are you joining us? When we took a look at our registration, this is what we found. We have researchers joining the call today. We have service providers, and we have educational agencies, from state departments to regional agencies to even districts. So we have a really eclectic mix for our webinar today, and hopefully you'll have a chance to garner some nuggets around Fidelity and some new learning, as well as maybe question your thinking about the topic further as we try to meet the needs of all the different audiences in our space today. So our objectives for this hour, what is Fidelity? We're going to cover that from our brief. If you didn't get a chance to read the brief, we'll have Amelia drop the link to the chat. Why do we measure it? Why do we need to measure it as part of our implementation work? How do we measure it? What are different ways? What does the process look like? Specifically, what is this OTIS that everybody keeps talking about? And then we're going to let John and Ashley really just take over and share what their experiences has been in regards to measuring Fidelity. So that's what the next 55 minutes are going to be spent with, hopefully a Q&A session at the end. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Corey Watkins to share with us what is Fidelity.
So again, good afternoon. So let's jump right into it so that we have as much time as possible. So when we think about fidelity, right, one thing we've provided a definition, but one thing that we really try to keep an eye on is just really think about local context and design, right? It's not just enough to say we're going to implement fidelity. What's that really mean? It really means we're trying to actually implement this innovation as designed, right? As it's intended, right? We're really trying to follow the instructions, follow the directions. What's it really look like? So we've tried to provide a definition. We're providing a definition for you as far as thinking about actually completing this or implementing as intended is where we want to go. So what's that really mean? So as we continue, a couple of ways to consider it. First of all, it's the fidelity of the process, right? Do we adhere to the essential ingredients? Thinking about the dose, the frequency, and the duration. I like to compare this to a recipe. We want to follow the recipe exactly, right? The fidelity of the process, right? We don't want to, skip any steps. We actually want to follow the recipe, exactly as designed, right? So that's what we think about with fidelity of the process. When we think about fidelity to practice, we're thinking about quality or competence, and just thinking about, are we responsive? We're thinking about adaptations. What we really want to think about here is just thinking that, our practitioners, our staff folks, they have the skill set to follow the program, but we want to make appropriate adaptations when necessary, right? So using our example of the recipe, you probably shouldn't add that extra cup of, sugar or water if it's not in the recipe, right? We want to actually implement this as designed. This is actually leading into what we're going to discuss next, which is integrity. So the question we get a lot is around fidelity and integrity. And things to consider, just, again, going back to our graphic, you should follow the core components of a program. That's how we measure fidelity, right? We're following the recipe, right, as designed. But we have to take into account different local contexts that could impact fidelity, right? So that fidelity of practice really is what makes us take into account integrity, right? So that's when we may have to make some adaptations, but we have to consider, before we do that, we actually have to implement, then we have to consider our local context, the practice, and then we get to the adaptations. Do we have to modify this? So again, as we continue to talk more about adaptations, what we really want to do is think about, how do we meet folks where they are, right? Staff members, our teachers are in that building. They are meeting the students where they are. But the idea is that we don't want teachers to just be functioning alone. We don't want them to make adaptations on their own. Really, this should be done through a communication feedback loop, right? So that's when they recognize there's a potential barrier, or there's a problem, there's a challenge with this curriculum. And the district can take into account as a whole, okay, this is something we didn't consider. We need to go back, revisit this, modify this plan, and then bring it back to our staff members, our teachers, to make sure that they actually can implement this with those specific adaptations. Because again, if we're trying to measure fidelity along with our impact, we need everyone to be doing the same thing. And if one teacher steps out on their own, it affects our outcome. So again, how do we make sure that folks stay on the same page and are traveling the same path?
So the big question, thank you, Corey, for explaining that to our audience and our perspective on fidelity, is why do we need to measure fidelity? When you think about fidelity and the collection of that data, it's usually readily available. It's available prior to student outcomes showing any changes. For example, you're going to collect it early on, and that information can really inform and motivate your implementation. We do want to really hone in on the fact that this is not about evaluation. This is not about teacher evaluation when you're collecting fidelity data. It is solely to collect data to really inform your implementation. Where are the challenges? Where are the barriers? Where are the gaps? What's successful, and how do you replicate that? Improvements in fidelity of data will occur relatively quickly, and you can see that and use that information to share results and successes with the critical perspectives at the table. And it really does inform and support teachers first and foremost, from administration to coaching staff to your district implementation team and your building implementation teams. You can utilize that data early on to support staff in the program or practice you're asking them to implement. So here's a graphic that we provided in our webinar to kind of describe this for you in a visual. And when you think about building teams, as a former building principal, I would use Fidelity data as a way of sitting down with my team and saying, okay, how can we help teachers with, do they need additional training? We have a gap here. Can we provide additional coaching supports? How can we look at this Fidelity data and correlate it with additional data points that we're collecting around capacity, around student outcome? And really, what stage are we in with implementation? As a district curriculum provider or superintendent, district implementation teams could use this to really see how their buildings are implementing, which buildings are being successful, which sites are struggling, how can they provide additional support? Are there policies in the way that might be hindering implementation, and how can that data guide those changes? All the way up to regional and state and those technical assistance providers. They utilize this data to really think about their supports at a larger scale, making improvements and action planning and funding and policy shifts. So really the use of the Fidelity data is critical to addressing implementation barriers early on. So I'm just going to reiterate, kind of going back to what Corey was saying about adaptations as an example, and that is that as the Fidelity data is collected, you can also take a look at where are teachers making those adaptations and why are they making them. Did they do it as a group? And if not, let's have that whole conversation. Is that adaptation needed elsewhere? What are we learning from it? And so really, I think taking into consideration this concept of the scope and sequence of curriculum or evidence-based practices, and really being able to assist teachers with that implementation as a whole group versus in isolation. And finally, when you think about communication, we always seem to skip this step. When we do all this data collection, you have all these different level of teams that need access to this data. So the why behind really collecting it also goes into celebrating and sharing out and making sure those communication loops are in place. So that way, all the way up from the building teams to the state level, there are key components that are being communicated up, and that bi-directional communication is occurring. All right, Mr. Corey, you're up.
All righty. So now we're going to jump into just how do we measure fidelity? So let's first of all think about practical measurements, right? So one thing to consider, of course, is the process of collecting data, right? That's extremely important. But we've got to think about what do we want to measure? So fidelity measurements can come in, the form of an observation tool, a survey, self-reporting methods, right? There's different ways. So we've got to consider what are we actually trying to measure. Also, we have to think about the context to fit the districts, right? So we have to have a tool that actually fits our program or practice and that we can use within the time frame of our day, and something that's not daunting, right? So our teachers have their plates full. Anything additional, is tough. So we have to make it something that they can actually do, right? They can actually manage this. They can actually do this. And also, we don't want to just collect data to collect data, right? How are we going to use it, right? So we need to have a data plan. How are you going to use the measurement? How are you going to use the measurement before you actually begin to use it, right? Like, what are we trying to learn from the data? What are we trying to learn from this tool? What are we trying to accomplish? So those are definitely important things that we must consider. All right. So again, today you're going to hear a lot about the OTIS. For us, the big idea is just around the use of the OTIS is it's around observation data. So it gives us an outside view of what's happening, what's actually happening. Is it actually happening as designed, right? Are we actually following what we said we're going to do? Remember, Rebecca's mentioned this earlier, the OTIS is not about teacher evaluation, right? It's examine our practice or the program. Are we actually doing what we've intended to do? Are we seeing it? And remember that the OTIS is short and it's sufficient and it's based on research and it is validated. So again, just quickly, some key things to continue to think about when we discuss, as we begin to discuss more about the OTIS. The 7 components are connected to Hattie's work on invisible learning. The 10-minute observations can be done by individuals who've actually obtained the training in the inter-observer agreement, right? So we just don't have anyone going in to say, we're going to do an OTIS. We actually have training for those folks and they have to have the inter-observer agreement before they can actually go in and complete the observation. And then we can, we collect the data points that are easily collected and stored in SISEP.org and examine for trend data. So we built this system. We've tried to follow what we mentioned earlier, practical measurements, right? We want to make sure that we, honor what we say the other folks should do. We try to honor that and do that the same way.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. So now we're going to jump into stories from the field. One component of SISEP's work is that we really like to lift up the work that our state departments are doing in regards to utilizing our resources and our tools and working with us. And Fidelity is one of those topics that that's a little gray and we're all working through it. So I'm going to go ahead and at this time, I'm going to turn it over to John Gimple from the Minnesota Department of Education to kind of share a Minnesota story.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I really love how you frame Fidelity as a superpower in this webinar. I'm kind of a fan of superheroes a little bit. And, when you think about superpowers, they really allow a person to tap into an unusual ability to reach top potential and create positive change. And in that way, reaching Fidelity really is a powerful thing because that's how it works. And Spider-Man is one of my favorites. And in that context, they use the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility. And that's really important when you think about Fidelity. We have a big responsibility to think about just being honest with what we're trying to accomplish. We have a responsibility to commit to improvement cycles and listening to people involved in the process. We don't want to misuse terms, potentially water down the idea of Fidelity. If we're using an effective tool and flowing data to support implementation teams, and we're using data to inform training and coaching, and we're monitoring the connection of Fidelity to improved student outcomes, we're going to be fulfilling that responsibility. Next slide, thanks. So Minnesota educators have been are being trained in the science of reading using letters. But only some of those folks who are being trained are included in our implementation project that I'll be kind of referencing today. We wanted to get started with a valid and reliable measure that aligned with the practices presented in the training, and the OTIS fit this need and has been correlated with student outcomes. Minnesota's not, we're not new to measuring Fidelity. We've done it for years now, but we are new to the OTIS tool and using it in this way, and measuring fidelity of an academic subject is kind of a newer territory for us too. So that's exciting. But we needed something that could be used to observe all the components of the science of reading over time. And we knew we could use other measures such as checklists that are specific to the components of literacy along with the OTIS as another source of data. But once we selected the tool, we were first trained to use the OTIS by SISEP. And then this included our state implementation team, some other state level staff, and the first school that was going to begin the use of the tool, which is a larger charter school. We eventually trained some other small groups of observers from other schools, from some districts, and overall, our observers in this last school year visited over 200 classrooms, which even that number even surprised me when I heard it when we got done. But we're really excited to do some more, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we also made improvements to our training over time. And one example was using the addition of classroom videos from actual Minnesota educators implementing those practices based on the science of reading that helped our observers really hone in on what they were looking at. Even though the OTIS can be used for any subject in any grade, we knew we would be using it for the specific task. Next slide. So this table shows how our trainings aligned with our observations. We trained some people just for informational purposes only. So we trained more than we needed to do observations, but about half will be doing observations in the next school year. We trained districts within a region over time and added those schools. And just for context, when we identify a region in this way, we're talking about establishing a regional implementation team to support the district. So it's not just any region. This region actually is working towards implementing these practices with these districts. And then you can see we added a booster training for those who we knew would be observers, and we wanted to build that inter-observer agreement. And then it also helped us decide how we were going to share observers among schools and even among districts, which helped us build our capacity. Next slide. So after those observations, we had some data, and you can see here the 7 areas of the OTIS and how strong each was based on the standard that we used with that tool. And when you look across these 7, the first, the third, and the 5th categories were generally lower than the others as we went on. But you can see there's quite a range of variance here among the different schools. Each color is a different school. And you also can imagine, just looking at the data, you might be observing some specific things, and we can talk about that in the question and answers later if you want. But you might think about how you might make some decisions based on what you're seeing in this data, and where you can really start to outrun your capacity because you see all of the areas where you need to help, but you can only do so much, right? So you really have to start asking questions about the data. Something like, as a coach, what schools would you decide to visit first? And what areas would be the most in need? Next slide. So when we think about what we learned, we learned so much. It's hard to even summarize all of it, but one of the main things was that messaging was really critical as we went out to these schools. You know, it just needed to be really clear that observations were for informing changes in training and coaching, and not for high stakes decision making around career advancement or performance pay or anything like that. So if observers are trainers and coaches, which a lot of ours were, the data is used for feedback really for them and not for the teachers. The teachers at the same time do want feedback, but we really need to let them know that, you know, these are just 10-minute observations. You can only see so much, but you can see a lot, which was another thing that we learned. We learned that you really could see a lot in that 10 minutes. But we needed to connect the process to additional coaching observations where they could work towards that coaching relationship. So we wanted to keep these system data separate from the coaching relationship data. And the big message is that collecting fidelity data is not evaluation. So kept that in mind. Another thing we learned was just using the data in cycles gets people past that initial fear. Both the observers and the practitioners had some level of fear with this and unknown. But once you allow people to see what the data reveals and allow people to see the changes that are made through action planning, you know, this starts to dissipate. And this is really a beginning stage issue. Once measurement is done well, we're finding that it's not a future concern. Another thing we learned, just getting the timing down. We wanted to train people when there was an opportunity to use these skills. And this seems obvious, but it's easier said than done. It takes a lot of coordination and relationship building in all of these districts. And I work with Vicki Weinberg at the Minnesota Department of Education. And She uses her own superpowers, and I mean that literally. She just seems to have a lot of them to make sure that true implementation is really happening in this transformation zone. And this includes keeping the training from our vendor consistent across the state, which is no simple task. Vicki also secured the help of Wendy Stitchen, who uses her superpowers at the regional level. And she just has this way of ongoing organization of people. And she's also moving forward building instructional materials with the University of Minnesota aligned to the letters training, which is critical because letters training is just training. And they need the support in order to make it real in the classroom. And she's identified strong people at the district identifies strong people at the schools, and we just keep making sure this implementation happens with each level supporting the next in the cascade. The review of the Fidelity data, though, it not only adjusts aspects of training on this for the science of reading, but also helped us adjust aspects of training for the OTIS observation too. And we just really learned that we needed a place beyond the OTIS to kind of record information we were seeing that wasn't covered by the OTIS. And we collected some of those in themes, and you can kind of see the table here, what it looked like, where we put information into these different areas that affected training and coaching. So you can see, there's things around improving instruction, there's training and coaching opportunities, but there's also potential system changes at the school and district level kind of themes that we pulled out that are going to be really helpful for the coaches. And the last thing I would just say is just collecting Fidelity data early in the implementation process really seems to make the collection of capacity data more effective and can, I think, lead to building capacity more effective and quicker. There was definitely a unique opportunity to celebrate during those administrations of the district capacity assessments and the regional capacity assessment, as participants reflected on the items that referenced Fidelity. It was fun to see. So Fidelity really is the best part of implementation, but it's also can be the hardest part, but the investment is really worth it. Next slide. So as we move into this year, we want to do more observations. It's kind of daunting, but we're going to do it. And again, I think when we see the word region here, we really want to stress that there's a regional implementation team linked between the state and the districts here to help support. And we're going to add more schools within our transformation zone. We did about 7 schools in 4 districts. We're going to do at least 16 in 6 districts. We haven't fully built all of our goals yet, but there could be even double that depending on what we can do with our teams. We're going to continue to check observer capacity in that way. We want to do multiple observations across many teachers and schools as possible within our transformation zone. But if we can't observe everybody, we're asking questions like, well, what is an adequate sample? Or like, how can we share observers across districts and even regions appropriately and easily with the people that we have trained, and how many more people are we going to have to train? But all of these are really important. What is critical in order to tie these practices to predictable student outcomes? We also want to keep our OTIS trainers like myself as an observer. So as trainers at the state or regional level, we can continue to participate, add the capacity that'll allow, but also help with the discussions with those we trained, and we'll continue to deepen the learning and improve future training. But overall, we just want to share more about this data. We look forward to we hope maybe from a year from now, we can do another webinar like this and share what else we have discovered. I think I'm going to, at this point, just thank you for your time and turn it over to Ashley.
Thanks so much, John. Great Minnesota story. I really enjoyed that. So here in Kentucky, I said earlier, we started this work back in 2014. And our focus has been on improving mathematics outcomes for students with disabilities, specifically at the 8th grade level. So as we began the work and math had been selected as that focus area, we knew that for us, the first step was to operationalize what high quality mathematics instruction looks like in the classroom. So we did that through the co-creation of a mathematics innovation practice profile. In that co-creation, we brought together a team of education partners that had diverse perspectives from every level of the system. So we drew on our regional partners that had already signed on to be part of the first transformation zone cohort, because we wanted to develop their capacity, as we knew, they were going to be the ones supporting the implementation of these practices. And because we wanted to build deep capacity and readiness across the state, we also included representation from our regional partners that would be future transformation zones. Also part of that team were math experts from other organizations in Kentucky that specialize in math, and representation from schools and districts, because they have that math knowledge along with classroom experience and practical application. And that's where these practices would be used. So we wanted to make sure their voices were heard. So this representative team developed the mathematics practice profile using the 8 mathematics teaching practices identified by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Once these practices were operationalized, we shifted our focus to how we would measure the system of training and coaching support that was available to teachers using Fidelity data. That data guided our decisions for system improvement so that we could support teachers in their use of the 7 effective teacher practices measured in the OTIS. So the OTIS was chosen for several reasons. Corey talked about some of these earlier, so I'm glad that you set me up for this. So one being that the practices are supported by research. We wanted to ensure that we have high quality research-based practices that we're asking teachers to use and supporting them in their use. Because we know teachers are the ones who improve student outcomes. So the practices in the OTIS are also intended for every student in the room to receive them. They're not specific to a certain group of students or grade level, and that was important because we wanted to ensure all of our students were receiving benefit from these practices. And the other piece of the OTIS that really fit our needs was that it's a short observation and it gathers the information we need to determine if the system is designed to impact change in student outcomes. So using the practice profile and the Fidelity data that were collected with the OTIS from 2014 to 2019, teams learned how to measure the overall health of the system and develop a training and coaching cycle that meets the needs of the teachers. So we were able to embed training and coaching into our schools and systems using data. So we were building this system of support for our teachers and using the OTIS data to engage in plan to study X cycles and determine the training and coaching needs of our teachers. It was really important to us that we brought teachers to the table. And so what I mean by that is there are always teachers on building implementation teams, and teachers with the support of their coaches, they reviewed that OTIS data in aggregate to identify areas for growth. And then the training and coaching that they needed were lifted to the building and district teams. One thing we talk about a lot in implementation science and the use of active implementation frameworks is that the onus to improve educational practice and student outcomes is not on the teachers. Teachers should absolutely be at the table, and teachers are going to be the ones implementing change in the classroom, but it's the system of support that equips teachers with the training and coaching they need to be successful. So we have actually seen the system of support improve student outcomes in a quasi-experimental design study. The schools in Kentucky who had committed to this work from 2014 to 2019 using the math practice profile in the OTIS outperformed comparison schools in improving outcomes for students with disabilities and students who are Black. So that brief is available on the SISEP website if you're interested in learning more about that data. If you'll go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So what are some things we learned in the use of the OTIS? When we started this work, we knew that developing a math-specific Fidelity tool was a goal that we planned to accomplish when we had the capacity to support that effort. So in 2018, we felt like we were in a place that we could take on the development of a Fidelity tool while maintaining the system of support that had been built. So that's when the Kentucky Mathematics Innovation Tool, or the KMIT, was created. So for this tool, we replicated the same processes from the OTIS in terms of ensuring there is an inter-observer agreement between participants, so there's consistency of scoring as they enter the classroom. So Corey also talked about this inter-observer agreement earlier, but what we mean by that is as teams are trained in the use of the KMIT, they'll watch videos and they'll go into classrooms and do some scoring, and then they come back together and they have conversations about what they saw and why they scored a specific item the way they did. And it's through those conversations that they develop a common language and their scoring becomes more aligned. And doing so creates more consistency and equity across a district. And that process came directly from the OTIS training because it works so well. Something else we learned was that we definitely wanted to maintain a focus on building the capacity of districts and schools in the training and use of the KMIT. Eventually we want our districts and schools to be able to maintain the system of support for teachers without as much regional and state involvement. So we do this using the I do, we do, you do model. So there's a gradual release of the training responsibilities to the district, and that helps maintain consistency in the process while giving ownership to the district. Next slide, please. One of our other biggest takeaways is the system of support. So earlier, Rebecca shared that graphic on how Fidelity data is used at each level of the system. And so each level of the system, meaning our state, region, district, building, and then teacher level. So I want to share how some of our regions have put this system of support into practice. We've talked about how Fidelity data is non-evaluative and we only use it to inform the system of support. But we also know getting teachers on board and building that trust takes time and it can be challenging. So something we've learned during this process is how to use teacher leaders as KMIT observers. So within some districts, their teacher leaders who are part of the building implementation team get trained as KMIT observers. So then when they go into the classroom of their peers, they do observations, and then they're able to have conversations with those teachers that they observed. So they'll talk to individual teachers about their own data, and then they'll look at that data in aggregate in professional learning communities or their content partners. So in these content partners or PLC meetings, they can set goals and discuss where they want to improve. And through that process, teachers see that this really is about using the data to set goals and inform the system. So the teacher leaders after those PLCs, they all participate on the building implementation team. And so they lift up what the teachers have identified as their training and coaching needs. So now the building team's aware of those. Then all the buildings have a representative that are on the district team. So when the building representative participates in those district meetings, the district team is now able to look at all of the data. So they get that quantitative data from the Fidelity observations, always viewed in aggregate, but they also now get some qualitative feedback from the teachers, and they can see where there might be district-wide training needs. And so that data can be lifted and shared to the region who supports that district, and the region can design trainings that they do. And some of them also create like teacher cohorts and academies where they focus on the mathematics teaching practices that are identified as an area of need across the district by the teachers. So this example just shows us how the teachers being part of the process, and when they are part of that process, they see how their input moves through the system, and it deepens their readiness and their buy-in, and they want to be more involved. So I'm going to share a really quick, cool anecdote with you. I think it's really cool, but I'm kind of a nerd. But so one of our regions shared with us that during COVID, we all went virtual like at the drop of a hat. And none of us knew what we were doing. We definitely didn't know how to do a KMIT walkthrough in a virtual setting. So we had to put those on pause. But within that region, teachers are reaching out to like their KMIT observer or their coach, or even directly to our regional partners and saying like, hey, I need you to come into my classroom. I need you to observe me because I've got to figure out how I'm going to reach my students. And so these teachers had seen how the KMIT observation, this Fidelity data, impacts their instruction and how it directly impacts students. So they were like hungry for that feedback. So I just really love that story and I love to share it. So Rebecca, one more slide for me, please. All right, so as far as our next steps, so we actually have some really great work going on with the OTIS, the preschool division within the Office of Special Education and Early Learning at KDE. Is usability testing the OTIS in preschool to determine if it's an applicable fidelity measure for the teaching pyramid model. So they've been using it in some really small slices for about a year, and now they're looking to see if they're going to have that potential to use it in a more widespread usability testing. So we're excited to hear how that goes, and we definitely look forward to learning from them. And then with the KMIT, up until now, the KMIT has only been used with our transformation zone partners. But next month, we're actually going to be releasing what's called the Kentucky Mathematics Toolkit to support students with disabilities. That's going to be released universally. So that toolkit's going to have our mathematics practice profile and the KMIT Fidelity measure with tips on how to use both of those. And we're working with some of our regional partners on doing more universal and targeted training and supports about the use of the practice profile and the KMIT in schools to develop that training and coaching cycle. So definitely really excited to see how we can impact more teachers and students across the state using the KMIT and the practice profile. Thanks.
All right. Thank you both, John and Ashley, for sharing your stories. We thought we'd take some time real quick to go ahead and open it up to a question and answer. I know one of the questions we have been getting since we have published the brief, as well as offered this webinar, was about OTIS training. Their OTIS is available. It can be utilized, but you have to go through some training with us first before you can dive into the use of it. But I think, I don't know, from hearing both of your stories, I'm hoping that our audience and our participants could really hear how you guys have been able to take that tool and really contextualize it to meet the needs of your regions and your districts and your schools. So now we're going to go ahead and open it up to question and answers. You can feel free to unmic if you so deserve. We're about at 72 participants, or you can throw a question in the chat. And Amelia will go ahead and monitor it. We'll give it a few minutes. And while people are kind of formulating their questions through this next section, I'm curious to both of you, what advice would you give our participants in our audience today if they're starting to think about fidelity measurements? Like, where do you even start with that conversation?
I will attempt an answer here. Really, when it comes to our fidelity, I think focusing on that non-evaluative piece. I saw in the chat earlier, we're worried about identifying teachers, and we know teachers are worried about how they might be evaluated. So I think building that trust is a good starting place for fidelity.
And we found that people leaving training are pretty excited about the tool, and they think their communications back to their school or district will go pretty smoothly. But once they start talking to their teachers about it, there seems to be some fear there of the whole process and what it means. And so we had to kind of go back and create some communications that were consistent across everyone, and just some real good talking points for them to use. And that did seem to help. The other advice I would have would be start small. Don't try to do this. Don't try to scale before you figure out how to do it, right? So you got to figure it out first.
And I think we have a question in the chat about that advice on how to approach the messaging for teachers and how to build that trust. And I think that's a hard one, because I think we live in a culture right now that's really heavily focused on evaluation. And so the idea of individuals coming in to observe, but that's not geared towards evaluation. And why are you using this data? And I heard some districts, their administration don't even participate in the collection of the data because of that. So is there any tips to the trade around building that trust for teachers?
Yeah, for us, and I totally understand the concern, because you're teaching your class and then 2 or 3 people come in with clipboards. That just doesn't feel good sometimes, right? But we really framed it as, we're observing you, so we know how we can do better as trainers, or how we can do better as coaches. Like, what are we missing? What did we not teach you? Really trying to focus it on us, and then thanking them for the information they gave us so that we can improve the support for everyone. And really stressing the idea that we're not using individual information for this. That helped a lot, I think. And sharing the data afterwards in aggregate, saying, this is what we got. and this is what we took from it. This is what we think we're going to do because of it is going to be really helpful going forward.
Yeah, John, I would agree with everything you said. And I mean, just as an example, you know, we rely heavily on our regions. Some of my regional partners are on the call. So, hey guys, and they do such a nice job of when they start working with a district or especially going into schools, it's extremely clear. This is not an evaluation. And I was speaking with a regional partner recently who told me that they were in a school talking to the principal, and the principal kept wanting to use it as an evaluation. And they finally said to them, you know, we're happy to support you, but right now you're not ready for this Fidelity tool, so we can support you in other ways. So I think it's just setting that clear boundary and holding to it, because, you know, we want people engaged in this work. We've seen that it improves outcomes, but we have to do it to the way it's meant to be done, and we have to protect the teachers. I also see, sorry, Rebecca, I'm going to take your job. I also see in the chat that it was asked, do you share results with teachers? Generally, the coach will meet one-on-one with teachers. They always get some sort of feedback. Some of our coaches maybe don't provide the specific numbers of an observation, but the teachers get some form of feedback, and depending on the relationship they have with the coach will determine sort of how that plays out. If it seems like it's going to come across as like you need to check all these boxes, then they kind of back away from looking at the individual teacher data.
Ash, I think you all are making a great point, and there's some wonderful information being shared in the chat. But I think someone in the chat has a great point to lift around communication, right? Because typically observation equals evaluation. And what we're trying to do is switch that to say, no, the purpose of these observations is to help us monitor the system, right? And to build the trust. They've mentioned it is just the idea that we have to build that trust so they understand we're not here to evaluate you. That's not, we're not taking your name. We're trying to see the practices in place so that we can look at our practices and say, what do we need to do to improve this? Which then in turn our teachers see, right? They see the changes in the practice, they see the modifications, and they know, okay, this isn't about evaluating me, it's about me as much as evaluating the system and how can we make it better to support our students. So I think those are great points to consider.
Okay. In the chat, it looks like Julie mentions the idea of collecting dosage. And how do you really accurately measure that dosage? Because I know from my experience with OTIS, those are scheduled, they are 10-minute snapshots, and you aggregate that data. So getting to something such as dosage around fidelity of the process, have you guys thought about that? Have you built that into your system at all? What does that look like?
You know, a lot of it really is, there's some separate data collecting that you need to do with the OTIS, obviously. But if we're going in and doing a bunch of, like when we did some of our observations, we just scheduled them during their reading block, which everyone was teaching reading at the same time. And we're going in 10-minute segments during this 90-minute block or whatever. You know, it could come up where you go into the class halfway through that 90-minute block and the teacher's no longer on literacy for some reason, like they're doing something else. That could be an indicator that maybe they're not, you know, giving the kids as much reading time as intended. But it really is more of a district trying to monitor that maybe in a different way, but the OTIS could pick up on some of it.
Yeah, I'll say we haven't really found like a specific way to measure dosage.
April's comment about additional data. So just to reiterate, we don't look at OTIS data in isolation, right? So we correlate it with a lot of different types of data, from our capacity assessments to student outcomes. What are all the additional data points that maybe you're working on correlating your OTIS results with?
So the ones we use pretty consistently would be, you know, obviously our Fidelity data. We use training data. So as our teachers receive training on the specific 8 mathematics teaching practices, that's logged. And so we can see what are we focusing on the most. what adult learning strategies have been used. We also use capacity data, so our district and region and building capacity assessments. And we also use student benchmark data. It's just sort of like a mid-year check-in point. And then once a year, we do use student summative assessment data.
Yeah, we're building right now training and coaching surveys. So people, after they've been trained, you do the general, how did training go for you? Or, did you like training? What the general stuff. But these go really in depth into the actual I do statements. To what extent can you do this statement of action that you were trained to do? And do you need help? Do you need a coach to talk to you? Where are you on the spectrum of doing that well in your classroom and feeling comfortable with it? So we're getting a lot of data about those specific things that we want people to be able to do. And then the coaching, we're building some coaching survey and log database pieces with a data dashboard where we can just see where coaches are working on, what they're working on the most, and who they're working with. Not specifically who, but like the number of people that they're working with within the number of people they could be working with, and why, just looking at all of that data to see how effectively they're able to work so we can support the coaches better.
All right. Is there anything else before we kind of wrap up and share some additional resources? Is there anything else, Ashley or John, that you'd like to share with our participants today?
I want to see everybody else's data too. We talk about being a data nerd. You just want to see, well, what are other people doing? I wish we had more places where we could share some of these high level pieces of data on what's being looked at and what people are doing with the data, so we can learn more from each other. So that's always an exciting piece. And again, I would love to share what we have and look at what anybody else has and talk about those things.
I like the idea of a follow-up webinar you mentioned too.
Mm-hmm.
This is quite the popular topic right now. So I think we definitely need to do that as we expand out. All right, well, let's get wrapped up here. So thank you again for joining us today. We do have some additional resources and we'll provide them in links for you when we send out the recording to this webinar. So we did record today's session. We will send out to you links to a blog written by Kathleen Ryan Jackson around the OTIS tool and the work within Kentucky, as well as a really nice video by Dr. Kim St. Martin from the Michigan MTSS Center, where she talks about integration. It's the integrated and compensatory discussion around drivers, but she talks about Fidelity at the top. And it's a really nice quick video that you can share out with your colleagues and your teams around Fidelity. And finally, we do have our podcast, the Implementation Science for Educators podcast, where we did a number of interviews from Kentucky around the use of OTIS and the journey into KMIT that you can also share and learn from. So you can look forward to those links as well as the recording of today's video. Additionally, join the conversation. So here's the deal. Join this conversation because it's a growing one. It's a hot topic in Fidelity. And we are constantly posting questions and resources. You can follow our guest and the host today, as well as the SISEP Center, or you can email us. We'll provide you with emails. So if you have direct questions around the approach that Minnesota or Kentucky took, you can email John and Ashley. Additionally, Corey and I are available to talk more about OTIS and how we can support your desired thoughts and wanting to learn more around that particular tool. So feel free to reach out. We've included our references for our work today, as well as the work from our brief. So some recommended articles for you. And with that, I just want to say thank you. I'll give an opportunity for our guest and Corey to say thank you. And Amelia is also going to drop in the chat, in educational terms, an exit ticket, we want to collect some data from you. I know you're surprised by that. So this was the first time we did a webinar in this style from one of our briefs to promote the work of our states. And we want to know, how was it for you? Was it a good experience? Did you want to spend more time on something? Did we answer your questions? Feel free to ask additional questions around Fidelity and the OTIS in the exit ticket, because we are going to be developing a FAQ document after today's webinar that will also be provided. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, John, and Corey to say their thank yous and good afternoons.
Thank you all so much for having me. I enjoyed sharing our story. If you all have any questions, please do shoot me an email. I'd be happy to talk data especially.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you all for being here and listening. And I would love to hear from you, especially if you're working on training in the OTIS. We always want to collaborate on that at this point, where we, as we learn more about it.
I just want to again say thank you to Ashley and John. Thanks for coming and providing this information, sharing, your data with us, and your willingness to talk about, your work in the past and where you are now. So it's really exciting and refreshing. Thank you everyone else who attended. We're excited to have you all here, and hopefully you'll come back and attend some more webinars, and maybe it'll be your opportunity to share with us.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and have Amelia drop that exit ticket one more time in the chat, and we are giving you 4 minutes to complete it, with hopes that you give us some feedback, because we do take your feedback seriously. And with that, we just want to say thank you and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located.